Hi, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy, and this is Jimmy. This is part 3 of Boule de Suif, Guy de Maupassant's great short story. We've read 2 parts. We left our travelers arriving at the village of Tots and being greeted by a Prussian officer. So again, this is translated by Raja Collette, and it's Guy de Maupassant's Boule de Suif. Let's go! All right. Now, here's the characters in that coach. Remember, I'm keeping track for you so you can tell. Can't keep the characters straight without a scorecard. You ready? The German demanded to see the permit to leave Rouen, signed by the general in command, which gave the name, description, and occupation of each passenger. He spent some time scrutinizing them all carefully and comparing their appearance with the information contained in the document. And then he said curtly, sharply, "All right," and disappeared. They breathed again. I breathed a sigh of relief, huh? What do you think? 1 second here. Whoops. They breathed a sigh of relief. They were still hungry, and supper was ordered. It was promised in a half an hour, and while 2 maids bustled about, apparently making preparations for the meal, the travelers went to look at their rooms, which were off a long corridor ending in a glazed door marked with a number indicating its function. What do you think that door is, ladies and gentlemen? Huh? Its function. Don't forget that this is the early days of plumbing, and there was only one plumbing room, right? At last they were about to sit down to supper when the landlord appeared, and he was a former horse dealer, a fat, asthmatic man with a wheezy, husky voice full of phlegm. His father had saddled him with the name Flauvenet. Saddled him. Got it? Horse dealer. See, isn't that a beautiful word? He saddled him. "Mademoiselle Elizabeth Rousset?" he asked. Boule de Suif gave a start and turned around. Now we know for the first time Boule de Suif's name, Elizabeth Rousset. "That's me," she said. "Mademoiselle, the Prussian officer wants to speak to you at once." "To me?" "Yes, if you are Mademoiselle Elizabeth Rousset." She hesitated, thought for a moment, and then said roundly, "Well, maybe he does, but I'm not going." Now, we all know why she's saying this. Don't forget, what was she trying to do before she left Rouen? She was going to strangle a Prussian, but then she had to get out of Dodge. Remember that? There was a general stir as everybody started talking and trying to guess the reason for the summons. The Count went up to Boule de Suif and said, "You are wrong to take that attitude, madame, for your refusal may have serious consequences, not only for yourself, but for all of your companions. One should never resist people who have the upper hand. I am sure that there could be no danger in your obeying this summons. It is probably to do with some formality that has been overlooked." Everybody backed him up. They begged, they urged, and lectured Boule de Suif until she finally gave way, for they all dreaded the complications which might ensue from an impulsive refusal. "All right," she said at last, "but I'm only doing it for your sakes." The Countess took her hand. "And we are very grateful to you," she said. Boule de Suif left the room, and the others waited for her to come back before sitting down to supper. Everybody regretted not having been sent for instead of that headstrong, quick-tempered girl. And each began silently rehearsing suitable platitudes in case he should be summoned in his turn. 10 minutes later, Boule de Suif reappeared, breathing hard, red in the face, and choking with rage. "The swine!" she stammered. "The filthy swine!" Everybody wanted to know what had happened, but she wouldn't say a word. And when the Count insisted, she replied with great dignity, "No, it has nothing to do with you. I cannot tell you." And so they sat down around a large soup tureen from which there arose the smell of cabbage. In spite of the recent incident, it was a cheerful meal. The cider was good, and Monsieur and Madame Louisier Monsieur and Madame Louisier and the two nuns drank it for the sake of economy, but the others ordered wine except for Courtenay, who demanded beer. He had his own special way of opening the bottle, giving the liquid a good head, and examining it, first tilting the glass and then holding it up between the lamp and his eyes to appreciate the color. And when he drank, his great beard, which was the color of his favorite beverage, seemed to quiver with emotion, and he squinted so as not to lose sight of the mug. He looked as if he were performing the one function for which he was born. It was as though he were establishing in his mind a connection, or even an affinity, between the two ruling passions of his life, pale ale and revolution, and he certainly never drank the one without thinking of the other. Monsieur and Madame Flaubert had their supper at the far end of the table. The man, wheezing like a broken-down locomotive, had too much congestion in his lungs to be able to talk while he ate. But the woman never stopped chattering. She recounted all of her impressions of the arrival of the Prussians and what they did and what they said, cursing them, first because they cost her money, and secondly, because she had two sons in the army. She addressed her remarks chiefly to the Countess, flattered at the thought that she was speaking to the lady of quality. I'll pause here for one moment. And then she lowered her voice as she broached more delicate topics. Her husband interrupted her from time to time, saying, "You'd do better to keep your mouth shut, Madame Flaubert." But she took no notice and went on. "Yes, madame," she's talking to the Countess, "those folk do nothing but eat potatoes and pork, and then pork and potatoes. And don't you go thinking that they're clean. Oh, no. They do their business everywhere, if you'll pardon me saying so. And you ought to see them drilling hour after hour, day after day. They all get out there in the field and marching backwards and forwards and turning this way and that. It wouldn't be so bad if they worked on the land or mended the roads in their own country. But no, madame, them soldiers are no good to nobody. And us poor folk have to feed them, and so they can learn all about killing. I know I'm just an old woman with no education. But when I see them wearing themselves out, tramping from morning to night, I says to myself, when there's folk finding out useful things, what's the point in others working so hard to be hurtful? Because isn't it a shame to kill people, whether they're Prussians or Englishmen or Poles or even Frenchmen? If you get your own back on somebody who's done you wrong, well, that's bad, because you get punished for it. But when you shoot our boys down like game, that's good, because those as kill most get medals for it. I tell you, try as I might, I'll never understand it." Courtenay raised his voice to say, "War is barbarous when it's an attack on peaceful neighbor, but it's a sacred duty when it's in defense of one's country." The old woman bowed her head. "Yes," she said, "it's different when you're defending yourself. But wouldn't it be better to kill all the kings as make the war for their pleasure?" Courtenay's eyes flashed. "Bravo, citizen!" he cried. Monsieur Carrère-Lamandan was deep in thought, and although he had fanatical admiration for great soldiers, this old peasant woman's common sense made him think of all the wealth that he could be created in a country if so many idle and therefore costly hands and so much unproductive strength were employed on great industrial enterprises it would take centuries to complete. Loisio, however, left his seat to go and have a whispered conversation with the innkeeper. The fat man laughed, coughed, and spit. His huge belly heaved with laughter at his neighbor's jokes, and he ordered 6 casks of claret from him to be delivered in the spring after the Prussians had gone. Perhaps that's wishful thinking. Supper was scarcely over when the travelers, who were tired out, went to bed. But Loisio had been taking everything in. And after getting his wife into bed, he first put his ear and then his eye to the keyhole, with a view to discovering what he called the secrets of the corridor. After about an hour, so he's looking through the keyhole for an hour. Think about that. After about an hour, he heard a rustling sound, peered out quickly, and saw Boule de Suif looking fatter than ever in a blue cashmere dressing gown edged with white lace. She had a candle in her hand, and she was making for the door with the number on it at the end of the corridor. And again, you know what that is, right? I told you. She's going to the toilet. Another door opened a little way, and when she returned a few minutes later, Courtenay came out in his shirt sleeves, and he followed her. There was a whispered conversation, and then they stopped. Boule de Suif seemed to be trying hard to keep him from entering her room. Louisio was unfortunately unable to hear what they were saying. But after a while, they raised their voices, and he caught a few words. Now, who's narrating this, ladies and gentlemen? It's the third-person narrator. The third-person narrator can tell us anything he wants, whenever he wants, why he wants, and the narrator chooses not to tell us what they're doing because Louisio can't hear. He's actually letting you see it through the eyes of Louisio, right? Louisio. Courtenay was being very insistent. Come on now, don't be silly. What difference does it make? She seemed to be indignant, and she replied, No, there are times when you just can't do that sort of thing. Besides, here it would be shameful. What are they talking about? There's the pronoun it. I told you about pronouns. Every time we read a story, a novel, a drama, pronouns are very important. What is a pronoun? It replaces nouns, ladies and gentlemen. Forget about what you hear about pronouns these days. Now, pronouns replace nouns. This word it would be shameful. There are times when you can't just do that sort of thing. It would be shameful. What is it? What do you think it is? What is she? What do you think it is? Of course, he's asking her for sex. He apparently failed to understand, and he asked why. He apparently failed to understand. What does that mean? That means he didn't, or he apparently? He apparently failed. And at that, she lost her temper, and she raised her voice more. Why? You mean to say you don't see why when there are Prussians in the house? Perhaps even in the next room? He said no more. This patriotic modesty on the part of a whore who refused to allow a man to make love to her with the enemy in the house must have revived something of his flagging sense of dignity. For after merely giving her a kiss, he tiptoed back to his room. She embarrassed him, didn't she? She's not going to do, quote, her job, because there's Prussians in the house. Louisio, excited by what he had seen, left the keyhole, skipped across the room, put on his nightcap, pulled back the sheet, uncovering his wife's gaunt frame, and waking her with a kiss, murmured, Do you love me, darling? Sorry. Silence fell upon the house. But soon, from some unidentifiable spot, which might have been the cellar or the attic, there came the sound of a powerful, monotonous, regular snore, a long-drawn, muffled noise with vibrations like those of a boiler on high pressure. Monsieur Flauvenet was asleep. He's got asthma. We were camping in northern Illinois once. This was a state park. And we were in tents at the time, right? So we're in tents, and it's dark outside, and all of a sudden you hear, and at first we thought, oh crap, there's bears in the park. Now, of course, there were no bears, but who knows? Your mind does strange things when it's pitch black, right? But it was some guy snoring. I don't know if you've ever heard snoring. Sometimes in a confined space, it's different, like in a bedroom or something like that. But when some people snore powerfully, And if you've never heard a powerful snorer, you're lucky. But there are people who can snore very powerfully, even without asthma. As it had been decided to start at 8 o'clock the next morning, the party assembled in the kitchen at an early hour, but the coach, its roof covered with snow, stood forlornly in the middle of the yard without horses or driver. It was just the coach. They looked in vain for the latter, the driver, in the stables, in the haylofts, in the coach house, and the men then decided to go and search the town. They found themselves in the marketplace with the church on one end, and on either side of the row of low house roofs, and the Prussian soldiers could be seen. The first one they saw was peeling potatoes, so they're looking at the Prussian soldiers. The second soldier further on was scrubbing out the barber shop. Another, bearded up to his eyes, was kissing a crying baby, dangling it on his knees and trying to calm it down. Buxom peasant women whose men were away at war were indicating by signs to their obedient conquerors the jobs which had to be done: the wood to be chopped, the soup to be ladled out, the coffee to be ground. One of them was even doing the washing for his hostess, a helpless old woman. So you see here that the Prussians are actually working. They're doing the jobs of the men who are at war. The Count, surprised by what he saw, questioned the verger. The verger is an official of the church who acts as the caretaker and the attendant, who's coming out of the presbytery. The old man replied, "Oh, this lot, they're not so bad. They aren't Prussians, or so they tell me. They come from some place farther off, though I don't know exactly where. They've all left a wife and kids at home, and the war's not much fun for them. I bet their women are crying for their men just like ours. And there's hard times coming for them as well as us. Though things aren't too bad here for the moment, because they don't do no harm, and they give us a hand, just like they were back home. You see, monsieur, poor folk have got to help each other. It's the rich that make wars." Okay? That may or may not be true, ladies and gentlemen, but if you haven't read with Jimmy the play by Aristophanes called Lysistrata, you might take a look at it. Cordenet was shocked at the friendly relations which had been established between the victors and the vanquished. He turned back, preferring to shut himself up at the inn. Why is Cordenet shocked? Well, he's a revolutionary, or is he? Loisio had to make a joke. Repopulation, that's the job they're doing. Reparation, you mean, Monsieur le Curé Lamandon retorted solemnly. But there was no sign of the driver. So finally, they ran him to earth. They ran him down in the village cafe, sitting in a friendly fashion at the same table as the officer's orderly. So the orderly is the assistant, right? The Count asked him, "Weren't you told to have the horses by 8 o'clock? "That's right, but later on I was told different," said the driver. "What do you mean?" "I was told not to put them in at all," he said. "Who gave you that order?" "Oh, the Prussian commandant, of course." "Why?" "Oh, I don't know," the driver said. "Go and ask him if you like. I'm told not to put the horses in, so I don't put the horses in, and that's that." "Did he give you the order himself?" "Oh, no, monsieur. The innkeeper passed it on." "When?" "Last night, just as I was going to bed." The three men returned to the inn feeling very uneasy. They asked to see Monsieur Flauvenet, but the maid replied that the master never got up before 10 on account of his asthma, and snoring perhaps. He had even given strict instructions that he was never to be called earlier, except in case of fire. They then asked if they might see the officer. But that was entirely out of the question. Even though he was billeted at the inn, Monsieur Flauvenet alone was authorized to speak to him on civilian matters. So they had to wait, and the women went back to their rooms, and they busied themselves with trifling odds and ends. Cordenet settled down in the chimney corner in the kitchen, where the huge fire was blazing. He had one of those little tables brought in from the cafe, and he ordered a mug of beer, of course, and took out his pipe which in democratic circles enjoyed a prestige almost equal to his own. As if it were in serving Corday, it was serving the country. It was a superb meerschaum, beautifully seasoned, talking about the pipe, as black as its owner's teeth, but fragrant, curved, shining, fitting comfortably in his hand, and forming an attractive adjunct to his face. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed now on the fire and the hearth, and now on the froth crowning his mug of beer. And after each drink he ran his long, thin fingers through his lank, greasy hair with an air of satisfaction, while he sucked at the foam fringing his mustache. What? This is superb writing. Can you picture that as I read it to you? What Courtenay's doing in the corner? Loisio, on the pretext of stretching his legs, went out to sell some wine to the local retailers. Of course he did. The Count and the manufacturer started talking politics and forecasting the future of France. The one believed in the Orleans family, but the other in some unknown savior, some kind of hero who would appear when all seemed lost. A Duguesclin, or perhaps a Joan of Arc, or even another Napoleon I. Oh, if only the Prince Imperial were not so young. Listening to them, Courtenay smiled like a man who knows the secret of destiny. His pipe filled the kitchen with its aroma. On the stroke of 10, Monsieur Flauvenet appeared. He was immediately questioned, but he had only one reply, which he repeated verbatim 2 or 3 times. The officer says to me, he says, Monsieur Flauvenet, you will give orders not to get the coach ready for those travelers tomorrow. I do not wish them to leave without orders from me. You understand, that is all. So he repeats that 2 or 3 times. They then obtained an interview with the officer. They tried to obtain. The Count sent in his card on which Monsieur Carré-Lamandon added his name and all his distinctions, of course. The Prussian sent word that he would see the 2 men after he had lunch, that was to say, about 1 o'clock. The ladies reappeared, and they all ate a little in spite of their uneasiness. Boule de Suif seemed out of sorts and extremely worried. They were finishing their coffee when the orderly came in to fetch the gentlemen. Loisio joined the original pair. But when they tried to persuade Cornudet to come accompany them to add weight to the deputation, Courtenay proudly declared that he would never have anything to do with the Germans, and he returned to his chimney corner, calling for another bottle of beer. The 3 men went upstairs, and they were shown into the best room in the inn. The officer received them there, stretched out in an armchair with his feet on the mantelpiece, smoking a long porcelain pipe, and wrapped in a gaudy dressing gown, which had probably been filched from the abandoned house of some middle-class citizen of appalling taste. He didn't get up. He didn't greet them. He didn't even look at them. He was a perfect specimen of the boorishness which comes naturally to the soldiers of a victorious army. After a few moments, he finally asked, "What do you want?" The Count asked it as a spokesman. "We wish to continue our journey, monsieur." "No." "Oh, may I venture to ask the reason for this refusal?" "Because I say so." "I would respectfully point out to you, monsieur, that your commanding officer gave us a permit to travel to Dieppe, and I do not think we have done anything to deserve this prohibition." "I say no. That's all. You can go now." The 3 men bowed and withdrew. The whole party spent a wretched afternoon. They couldn't understand the German's capricious refusal, and the most fantastic explanations occurred to them. Everybody stayed in the kitchen, engaging in endless discussions and putting forward the unlikeliest theories. Perhaps it was intended to hold them as hostages, but for what? Or to take them away as prisoners, or more likely, to hold them to ransom? At this possibility, they were stricken with panic. The richer members of the party were the most terrified. already seeing themselves forced to pour sacksfuls of gold into the hands of that insolent soldier in order to save their lives. They racked their brains for plausible lies, for realistic lies, to conceal their wealth and enable them to pass themselves off as the poorest of the poor. Loisio took off his watch chain and hid it in his pocket. The gathering dusk added to their fears. The lamp was lit, and there were still 2 hours to go until dinner. Madame Loisio suggested a game of Trentenon to pass the time. 31 is a gambling card game played by 2 to 7 people where players attempt to assemble a hand which totals 31. Everybody agreed, and even Courtenay joined in after politely putting out his pipe. The Count shuffled the cards and dealt. Boule de Suif got 31 straight away, and soon the excitement of the game made the players forget their fears. But Courtenay noticed that Loisio were helping each other. The Loisios were helping each other to cheat. Aha! They were cheating. Just as they were sitting down to dinner, Monsieur Fauvenet reappeared and said in his husky voice, "The Prussian officer wishes to know if Mademoiselle Elizabeth Rousset has changed her mind yet." Boule de Suif remained standing. She was very pale, but suddenly she flushed crimson, choking with rage and unable to say a word. And finally she burst out, Tell that blackguard, that scoundrel, that swine of a Prussian that I'll never do it. Never. Have you got that clear? Never, never, never." The fat innkeeper left the room. Boule de Suif was immediately surrounded and questioned and begged to reveal the secret of her visit. And after she refused, but soon she was carried away by her rage. At first she refused. "What does he want? What does he want? He wants to bed me. He wants to go to bed with me." The general indignation was so keen, nobody was shocked at the crudity of her language. Courtenay slammed his mug down on the table so violently he broke it. There was a chorus of reprobation against the despicable soldier, a storm of anger which brought them all together in a common feeling of resistance, as if each had been asked to share in the sacrifice demanded of her. The Count declared in a tone of disgust that those Prussians were no better than the barbarians of old, and the women, in particular, lavished intense and affectionate sympathy on Boule de Suif. The nuns, who appeared only at mealtimes, bowed their heads and said nothing. All the same, once the first outbursts of indignation had subsided, they had their dinner. But there was little conversation because everybody was thinking. The ladies retired early, leaving the room to smoke and get up, the men to smoke and to get up a game of écarté. Monsieur Fauvenet was invited to join in, as the others intended to question him tactfully, as is the best way of overcoming the officer's resistance. But he was so absorbed in his hand that he listened to no questions and he gave no answers, simply repeating continually, "Play, gentlemen, play!" His concentration on the game was so intense, he actually forgot to spit, an omission which occasionally produced organ notes in his chest. Sorry. His wheezing lungs ran the whole asthmatic gamut, from deep bass notes to the husky squawks of a cockerel trying to crow. I love this writing. He even refused to go upstairs when his wife, who was dropping with sleep, came to fetch him. So she went off alone, for she was an early bird, and she always woke up with the sun, while her husband was a late bird and always only stirred to sit up all night. He preferred to sit up all night with his friends. And he called out to her, "Put my egg flip in front of the fire." And he went on with the game. What do you think that is? Put my egg flip in front of the fire. Probably a bed warmer, right? It's cold. When it was clear that there was nothing to be got out of him, they all declared that it was time for bed, and so they all retired for the night. They got up early again the next morning, filled with a vague hope an increasing desire to get away, and a dread of the prospect of spending another day in that horrible little inn. So it's now day 2, right? Alas, the horses remain in the stable and the driver still invisible. For want of anything better to do, they hung around the coach. Lunch was a melancholy meal. There was a certain coolness that was noticeable in the general attitude towards Boule de Suif. For sleeping on the problem had somewhat modified her companions' views. They now almost felt annoyed with this prostitute for not having gone to the Prussian on the sly so as to provide her fellow travelers with a pleasant surprise in the morning. Can you imagine this? I want you to think about this. There's a little arrow Jimmy put here to think about this. These people now felt almost annoyed that the prostitute didn't go on the Prussians on the sly to give her fellow travelers a pleasant surprise. Who the hell are they? You know how she feels about Prussians, right? What could have been simpler, they thought. Besides, who would have been any of the wiser? Who would have been any of the wiser? She could have saved her face by sending word to the officer that she felt sorry for the others. After all, it was such a trivial thing for her. Is that true, ladies and gentlemen? Is it such a trivial thing for her to go to bed with the Prussian? Is it? Think about it. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Boule de Suif by Guy de Maupassant. And that was part 3 of the story that we're reading. And we know now why they're being kept in the town of Totes by the Prussian officer, right? He's keeping them there until Boule de Suif goes to bed with him. And these people now, her fellow travelers, are getting a little anxious that she's not doing it. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. Email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Hope you're enjoying the story. One more part. Let's see how it turns out. Thanks for staying.